Welcome to Vintage Hollywood Archive. There are other women of the classic film noir, but what about Lizabeth Scott? She is famously known for her come-hither voice. Some refer to it as a smoky voice. Well, Lizabeth Scott had a mixed allure with the husky blonde. She had a thing with the screens, not just for movies, but also for photographs. She didn't make one or two appearances in Harper's photographic spread, but she made countless appearances as a model. How Lizabeth Scott scared away her co-stars. Make sure to watch the video until the end, and if you're new here, don't forget to join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Vintage Hollywood Archives channel. Lizabeth Scott, the Hollywood Threat. At the performances and the peak of her career in the late 1940s and early 1950s, she was a leading lady of screens, which saw her lead dozens of film noir. She had eyes and exotic that compelled her for stardom. Just in detail, her eyes were mesmerizing, piercing, and wounding. She was among the sexiest women to ever grace the screens, besides femme fatales like Ava Gardner. Cinderella with a husky voice, Bogart's character meticulously described Scott when they met for the first time. With sparkling, luminous eyes, shimmering blonde locks, sculpted cheekbones, and a slinky figure, no words could ever describe Scott's beauty. She was a charm. Surprisingly, Lizabeth didn't think of herself as gorgeous. Scott was gracefully characterized by beauty of style, shape, and execution. Let alone the description, she was pleasing and constantly kept pleasing producer Hal B. Wallace. His obsession for Scott may have compromised nearly every part of the films that Scott featured. Poor Wallace, but that tells how beautiful Scott was, and Wallace didn't have a happy ending as you would imagine. Instead, the obsession compounded, and he remained watching Scott's old movies on a nightly basis. Clearly, he wanted more. Lizabeth Scott was a screen stealer, an eye-pleasing presence. It made the viewers want more of her on the screens, insatiable. She came into publicity after playing The You Came Along in 1945. She dominated the play as an escort girl in love. Not that spectacular, but rather a concrete one. You could still be wondering why she was a threat in the film noir. Don't worry, take it easy. In numbers, Lizabeth Scott performed 6 plays and 22 films. Is that too much for a person? Yes, but not for Lizabeth Scott. She went for what her heart desired, and instead used the yearning as fuel. She lit up throughout her life. Her inclination never dwindled at any point whatsoever. She mentioned, "When you say ambition to me, that's when you get me started. My great ambition is to be the whopping best actress in Hollywood. You can't blame a girl for trying." Lizabeth Scott's performance in the film noir had faced pent-ups, and it was never stars and sunshine. She persevered and deeply rooted her ways in the film industry, featuring in an aloof of film noir classics. She had to work with a tempestuous bankhead in the film, The Skin of Our Teeth, in 1942. Lizabeth Scott didn't know what giving up was, and it never crossed her mind. Although many frustrations could overwhelm you as an individual, Scott stayed rooted in the course. She had a crystal understanding of what was meant for more stardom. Born in 1922, September 29th, as Emma Matzo. She was brought in Pennsylvania of Slovakian descent during her tender years. Her father owned a Matzo market that was a muscle in her rise to stardom. He did everything a parent could ever do to see their child's dream become a reality. Lizabeth Scott's adult life is the complete opposite of her childhood. She was brought up in a Christian family and attended Maywood Seminary for the Catholic girls. Lizabeth Scott adopted characters later in her life, scandalous, which riddles everyone with landmines of havoc, if really her upbringing had anything to do with her sprouting dramatist persona. Nobody hates their name. Do you? Well, Lizabeth Scott did not like her name. You are yet to understand. With a progressive engrossment in Hollywood's golden era, Scott read Maxwell Anderson's Mary of Scotland, a play about Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I. Afterwards, she easily adopted her stage name of Elizabeth Scott. She borrowed royalty, and was anyone ready to handle her? In later years, Scott dropped the E to Beetle, which turned out auspicious as she was recognized as Lizabeth Scott. Scott described herself as rebellious and outspoken as a teen girl, in spite of her mother telling her to subdue her sentiment and be a lady. When asked what the best advice she was given, she responded boldly, "I don't know, but I sure didn't take it." She exuded enchanting allure, the kind of feline allure that belies danger and a maelstrom scheming, trickery, and double-dealing. Her personality completely contrasts with the royalty she borrowed, or is it the dues she was paying? Notwithstanding, Lizabeth Scott's on-screen image was repelling with her real life. She was always thinking elsewhere and absent-minded about a different kind of life, which was a perfect blend for her classic noir character. Lizabeth always displayed the character of a good girl gone bad, gone good again. She was not afraid of standing up for what she wanted, which made her powerful. She riddled everyone, and with that, her personality remained a jigsaw. She stood in between on-screen and off-screen with a distinctive elaboration on Scott's personality. She played unsympathetically, yet seductive schemers connivingly. Not time to look back, Scott struck fear into the hearts of everyone she ever set eyes on in Hollywood. She dubbed her name the Threat, since no one stood in the way of her success. She stated, "I don't want to be as closed a personality, something to stare at. I want to have my talent respected, not only by the public, but by myself." Instead, she stirred mild anger from her co-stars. Her life was thrilling as the plot of the films she featured. Not to mention, Scott was a big risk taker. As they say, big risks often reciprocate higher returns. She was in for the big bite. After countless acting in the local theater, she decided she wanted to act on Broadway. So how does a teen girl with a charged desire from Slovakia decency get to have a big apple? Remember, her father owned a shop that connects the dots, and of course, her father helped play an imperative role. Scott's rebellious nature can be traced to the dissimilitude between her law of averages and the inner nature of her cultured habits. Her rebellious nature can be concluded from the line spoken by Lancaster, her co-star in the 1948 film I Walk Alone. Lancaster showed multiple disappointments from Ridley's rebellious nature and said, "What a fall guy I am." He further mentioned, thinking just because you're good to look at, you'd be good all the way through. Scott was slowly camouflaging her characters in the on-screen scripts to an extent. In retrospect, she molds the characters and becomes rebellious in every dimension of her life. She scared away stars Burt Lancaster, Victor Mature, and Lucille Ball. Burt Lancaster's scenario could be termed bitter lovers on set, since he had been romantically connected to Scott. However, things took a bend. What makes you wonder is how the duo did not manage to have astute professionalism that was rather polished uprightly with ethics. Lancaster wanted to break his contract with Paramount Pictures, and his reason was astonishing. It was the third time. In addition, Scott's rebellious nature can be traced to her domineering nature. She pushed Lucille Ball away from a co-actor to a supporting role in the 1949 film Easy Living. It was a non-noir football drama. And guess who was having the lead part? Lizabeth Scott, the Hollywood Theater. What could Scott have done to send away her co-stars? Certainly, it is because she was rebellious and wanted to own the stage alone. She had a cold-iced attitude. Little Emma studied music at her tender age before moving to New York after high school. In 1942, she took her prowess to the stage and acted The Rain, anticipating that she would attract criticism from various places around New York. In 1957, the sensational megastar released an album of torch songs and romantic ballads titled Lizabeth. The show was an off-Broadway production. Wait, during her performance on stage, there was someone amidst the elated fans who were entertained all through. She had labyrinths of confusion through her mind, like a paintbrush through the rapids. She knew she was a good actor already, if not for just one problem. She was not receiving critics like she expected. They would arrive knocking, knock knock. Her performance on The Rain manifested in the least expected ways. There was someone way more pivotal than the critics she anticipated for. her dream of acting on Broadway was still a far reach. Look, Michael Meyerberg, a producer, was within the crowd. It was a perfectly placed moment and a fruitful coincidence. Michael did see Scott's performance in The Rain. Guess what? He was astonished by the sterling performance Scott kept up with while on stage. You can't blame a young girl for trying one of Scott's words. She was hired as an understudy for a megastar, Talitha Bankhead. At least she was witnessing her fate and a glance at her dreams. The duo was to perform the Broadway play, The Skin of Our Teeth. Unfortunately, it was never a bed of roses for Scott, as there were underlying issues with her duty as an understudy. It was the temperamental Tallulah Bankhead. Scott knew she was destined for movies. She once said, "I wanted to be a great stage actress." She faced turmoil and hard rock moments that led her to model that was paying her $25 per hour. Through her pictures, she landed a long-term contract once more in Hollywood. Although she started her career with the Hellzapoppin' comedy, she mentioned one time when being pre-interviewed on touring the pre-Hollywood, it was Hella-Poppins all the time. For the first year and a half, we traveled from coast to coast. During one stretch, we made 64 one-night stands in succession. It got so we weren't conscious of what town we were playing in. Just 64 days of haze. We were sociable and jolly except when we were dead from lack of sleep. But in such close intimacy, there was no privacy. My dream then, my joy now, is to be alone, lock my apartment door, and not even answer the phone. Some of the genres for which Scott is best remembered was dubbed film noir. Nearly all the films were inclined towards hard-boiled realism, emphasizing the shady underside of human society, replete with indeterminateness, cynicism, and every present possibility of double-crossing. She once said in a 1996 interview about why the film noir had become so popular, "We're always boy meets girl, the boy ends up marrying the girl, and together, and they go off into the sunset." And suddenly, in the 1940s, psychology was taking a grasp on society in America. That's when they into the psychological, emotional things that people feel. That was the feeling of film noir. It was a new realm, something very exciting, because you were coming closer and closer to reality. Scott's sultry looks understood the modeling assignment, and that her image was used to magazines, adverts for Royal Crown Cola. She worked as a model for the Walter Thornton Agency. Producer Hal B. Wallace significantly elevated her rise to stardom over a couple of years. Lizabeth made her way to Hollywood in 1944 after reaching the contractual agreement with Paramount Studios. Her zeal was prepared. for the showbiz, and her film noir snailed with an emotional roller coaster. Her films were sassy, and between 1940 to 1950, she pulled crowds to watch the films. Some of her best movies are You Came Along in 1945. She worked hand in hand with Robert Cummings. A year later, she featured in a more enticing classic noir, The Stranger Love of Martha Ivers, opposite Stanwyck and the duo of Van Heflin and Douglas. They graced the screen merrily, and the debut was a success. She started gaining traction and Hollywood attention. Certainly, the film communicated situations that America was battling after World War II, malfeasance and scrupulous erosion. The theme of the play was specifically targeted at the rich America's upper class. Scott's love for the screen didn't take a breath, and for a minute in 1947, she strewed with Bogart in the film noir classic Dead Reckoning. She imitated a femme fatale who tries to foil Bogart's fact-finding into the force's friend's baffling demise. Scott once said, "You know I loved making films. There was something so exciting about it because I fell in love with the lens, and the lens fell in love with me. I don't know how it happened. A lot of Broadway actors would say, I never want to work in Hollywood. I can't cope with it. But there was something about the lens that I adored, and it adored me back. So we were a great combination." After 2 years of making the Dead Reckoning debut, she starred in The Desert Fury in 1947. She mimicked a rogue student expelled from an elementary boarding school who later returned to her Nevada home, where her mother operated a bordello. Do you understand what it means to create your own doors? Scott had an adept understanding of the same. She created her doors. After starring in I Walk Alone beside Burt Lancaster, Scott played the role of a nightclub singer in the movie. In 1948, she appeared in The Pitfall beside Dick Powell. She later did a duo of movies in 1949, Easy Living and Too Late for Tears. Hollywood stars always had their way with scandals, which was a way of life. Certainly, Lizabeth Scott was not left out, and she was in the band. In September 1954, a landmine of a scandal moved Scott. She was featured on a magazine's front page that made allegations she was into fellow women. On a trip to Paris, she was accompanied by a nosy lesbian entertainer, Freed, that pulled the accusations in her direction. They were nearly ruinous. The reporters were nosy, and they tried pulling every string to paint Scott with lesbianism that was deemed a taboo. She later poured out her frustrations after her pursuit failed and said, "I'm tired of that smart New York set who blast Hollywood, calling it an intellectual void. Plenty of silly things are done here. However, Hollywood isn't so very screwball. They do fine things in the theater and splendid things out here too. Baddies crop up on both coasts. I dislike when critics sell Hollywood short." Lizabeth Scott was widely known for her private life, which later manifested in her cancellations of interviews and the Hollywood paparazzi. Scott was never a kiss-and-tell person, and it helped her take charge of her private life. Certainly, she didn't have skeletons in her closet regarding her love life, or if there were some, she wasn't as careless to let loose the cat. However, she got married to Stas Reed in 1947, and after 12 months, it failed. She tried again, and this time, she married Jerry Hersfeld in 1958, and by 1959, she got divorced. Well, it was 2 failed attempts, and she decided to stay single. On the verge of her rise to stardom, she had engagements with her producer, Hal B. Wallace, and even had something smoky with Burt Lancaster. She just kept the buzz fading. Conversely, taking archaeological expeditions into Scott's life, it appears like a royalties valley that has not been dug up. She had impacted the class film noir and brought life to the golden era. Her film legacy will carry on from generation to generation. She is remembered for many resolute activities. She was the queen of the classic noir, and a series of her movies still have popularity. I Walk Alone, Pitfall, Dead Reckoning, and The Desert Fury. In addition, Scott is remembered as an independent lady with an astute touch of decency. She was not compelled to bend to Hollywood's pressures. Lizabeth Scott died on January 31, 2015. She passed away after being diagnosed with congestive heart failure. She died at the age of 93 years old. After her cremation, her ashes were given to her longtime friend, Mary. Lizabeth Scott had one of the strongest personalities in Hollywood, but she is not the only one with interesting things to say. Why was Claire Trevor always a nasty person? Watch this video and find out.